Welcome back to the Prog School. For the next couple of weeks, I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to do some ranking videos, ranking the albums of some of my favorite bands, maybe some songs too. I have a ton of work this next month or so I need to do a few videos that are a little bit less labor intensive than my normal big lesson videos. I'll get back to those soon enough. But in the meantime, I thought it'd be fun to talk about some of my favorite bands and some of my favorite albums. I'm going to start this off with Symphony X, which is one of my favorite bands of all time and one of the most important bands to me, especially when I was younger. And I've done a couple lessons on Symphony X in the past. I've done a lesson on the riffing style of Michael Romeo, as well as the polymeters from the song The Accolade. You can check those out. I'll link them down below if you want to get some Symphony X actual lesson content. So this is going to be my ranking of the Symphony X albums. I'd be curious to know how you would all rank them, so let me know your list in the comments, and let's get into it. I'm going to preface this by saying that I don't think Symphony X has a bad album. I think they're all 8 or above for me if I was to actually number rank these. So any of these ones that are lower on the list are still great albums. There's just some that I like more. And at the bottom of the list is their self-titled album, Symphony X from 1994. And really the biggest reason that this is at the bottom for me is because it doesn't have Russell Allen singing on it. It has Rod Tyler, which I guess is the name of the original singer, and he doesn't do a bad job on this album. He has a pretty good voice and there's some good moments, but Russell Allen is such an important part of Symphony X to me. His voice is one of the key components that make their music so good, and he's such a killer vocalist. I've seen them live before. He's one of my favorite live metal vocalists I've ever seen. Absolutely insane how good he is. And so this album really lacks because of that. It doesn't really have the power because of the vocals that the other albums have. And it is the first album, so it's still them kind of finding their sound, although Romeo has a lot of his sort of tropes in writing already at this point. And there's some really good songs on here. I do like Masquerade. I think the last song, A Lesson Before Dying, is good as well, the longer one. So there are definitely good songs on here and really good moments, but it just is not quite there because of the vocals and because the band's trying to find their way early on. And of course, the production kind of takes this one down as well, which is the case for some of these other early Symphony X albums as well. Listening to them with a modern ear, I'm noticing the production is, not up to snuff. But some of those albums are so good that it doesn't matter, and you'll see them much later on this list. So at the bottom, we've got the self-titled album, Symphony X. In this ranking, I'm just doing the 9 studio albums, so I'm not going to do the live album they put out in 2001. So number 8 on my list, all the way from the first album now to their latest album, Underworld, from 2015. And I do like this album. This is a good album. There's some good material on here. I really like Nevermore. I like Kiss of Fire. I actually like the title track as well. But I think this album especially lacks the symphonic element. That's one of my favorite things about Symphony X, is the sort of orchestral symphonic element. And you'll see that later in this list, which ones I rank really high. And this album has great riffs. It still has Russell Allen singing. There's some good catchy moments in here. Great solos, of course. Romeo always has those. But it's just missing something catchy from it. Like even the other newer Symphony X albums that are heavy in this realm, I think they do a better job of kind of incorporating hooks and having more memorable parts of their songs. So there's not really much in this album that I go back to that often compared to other Symphony X albums. So that's why it's lower on this list. Once again, still a great album, and if I want some good riffs, I might throw this one on, but I'd actually probably throw on a couple of the other later Symphony X albums if I want the heavy Symphony X instead of Underworld. So this one sits at number 8. Sticking with the newer albums, in 7th place, I've got Iconoclast from 2011. Now, I absolutely loved this album when it came out. I was at a really good age for this album. I was 23, and I was just getting into heavier music, and so the heavy riffs on this album hit me really good. And I put this one above Underworld because I think there's a couple of real standout songs on here, specifically the title track, Iconoclast, and then the big ballad, When All Is Lost. There's some other songs I really like as well, like Prometheus and Bastards of the Machine, and Dehumanize, which almost has like a djenty kind of riff in places, which is kind of all the rage back in the early 2010s. But I think what puts this above Underworld is the songs, but also just the riffs too. There's some absolutely monster riffs on this album and some really good solos. And of course, Russell Allen sounds great as always. He's really in his sort of heavy mode here. Lots of his more real distorted singing voice, which I like. I kind of miss the quieter elements on this album. This is a very bombastic, in-your-face metal album, but it's a good album. And if I want really aggressive, energetic Symphony X, I'll come back to this one. So number 7 is Iconoclast. In 6th place, we're going to go way back to the beginning again with The Damnation Game, the first album that Russell Allen sang on from 1995. Now, this is an awesome album, and there's a couple of real standout tracks on here, specifically The Damnation Game. I love that, a really fast, energetic Symphony X song. I still remember how to play that whole intro part. It's something that's kind of like burned into my fingers, that I'll never forget probably. The Edge of Forever is probably my favorite track off this album. It's a longer Symphony X song that kind of hints at some of the stuff they're going to do in a few albums after this. And then, of course, the Winter's Dream Suite at the end of this album is good as well. This one is a little bit less consistent overall for me. I think there's a few tracks in the middle where it kind of drags. But with Russell Allen here involved in a couple of real killer tracks, that puts The Damnation Game up at number 6. In 5th place, we're going to 2007 with the album Paradise Lost. This is another one that I was absolutely obsessed with when it came out. This was the first album that came out after I had gotten into the band. Having some time to sit with it, it's not quite as good as a few of their earlier albums, but this is the best heavy Symphony X album to me. It has all the heavy, awesome riffs and the Russell Allen's like super aggressive voice, but it still has some proggy elements and some of those softer moments as well. A song like Paradise Lost has some really good softer elements to it. Then there's a few longer tracks that have more progressive elements. A song like The Walls of Babylon or even Revelation. There's softer moments on The Sacrifice too. Really cool kind of dynamic contrast here and there. Not quite as much as some of their earlier albums, but it definitely is there. But there's some banger songs on here. Domination, Set the World on Fire, Serpent's Kiss, Eva's Seduction, Seven, which has that like crazy neoclassical beginning part. I remember learning that on guitar. So lots of really good songs on this album, and I think it's a very consistent album. Compared to the other 4 albums I've done so far, this is a much more consistent album. I think it's good songs all the way throughout, and that's what kind of puts it higher than the other ones so far. So in 5th place, we have Paradise Lost. Now, these top 4 albums for me are all 10 out of 10s, and I feel like I could put them in almost any order, but since I've got to rank these, in 4th place, I'm going to put 1998's Twilight in Olympus, which is an absolutely incredible Symphony X album. This is the only album that doesn't feature Jason Rulio on the drums, but the drumming is still great on here, so I don't think it affects it too negatively. But this album has some awesome songs. I love Smoke and Mirrors. That's a great classic Symphony X super fast song. There's In the Dragon's Den. I love that kind of unison section in the middle. Another one that I remember learning on guitar. But my favorite song on here is Through the Looking Glass. I think it's a really good example of a longer Symphony X song. Obviously not as long as some of the really big epics, but it has all of the sort of elements that I love about this progressive symphonic version of Symphony X in their earlier days. And there's some really nice softer moments on here as well. Lady of the Snow, which ends this album out, is a really beautiful song. Not my favorite Symphony X ballad, but it's a good one. And this is a really consistent album throughout as well. I really like every song on here. There's just a few albums that are a little better. Now, these top 3 were really tricky for me to rank, and I almost hate to do this because it's such a classic album, but at number 3, I'm going to put 1997's The Divine Wings of Tragedy. This is probably Symphony X's most famous album, the one that put them on the map. And there's not a bad song on this album. It's absolutely killer from start to finish. It has some of their most famous tracks like Sea of Lies and Out of the Ashes and Of Sins and Shadows, and of course the title track. Now, my favorite song on this album might actually be Candlelight Fantasia, the last song on the album, which is maybe the best example of a Symphony X ballad. Russell Allen gives one of his best performances on that song. I love the way it builds and flows and the dynamic contrasts. But of course, the title track is incredible as well, and all of the sort of faster songs at the beginning too. This is really the sort of perfect example of Symphony X at their most symphonic, at their most classical. And that's one of the reasons I love this one so much. I think the other 2 albums above this are just a little bit better. So at number 3, we've got The Divine Wings of Tragedy. In number 2, we have The Odyssey from 2002, and I don't think this is as consistent of an album as The Divine Wings of Tragedy overall. There's a few songs in the middle where I'm kind of like meh on them, but this one takes the second spot only because of the song The Odyssey, which is probably Symphony X's best song and their real big epic. An absolutely incredible journey to listen to that song. I've seen them perform it twice. So cool. And, every time it gets to the end of the song with the triumphant champion of Ithaca, I'm pumping my fist. But there's other good songs on this album as well. I love Inferno. It's a classic Symphony X song. There's The Accolade 2. I love Awakenings as well. It's just a few songs in the middle that don't quite match the rest of the album. But The Odyssey really puts this one over the top for me. So in second place, we have The Odyssey. And at number 1 is V or 5, the New Mythology Suite. I'm not sure if it's V or 5, maybe someone in the comments can let me know. But this has always been my favorite Symphony X album. If you watch my top 10 albums of all time that I did a few years ago, this should be no surprise to you because this album was on there. And I think it's really the perfect example of everything that Symphony X does well. This is the first album where it really starts to get even heavier, so you have those super heavy moments that you'll get more of on later albums, but you still have all of the really progressive elements. You have all of the orchestral stuff going on with the interludes here and throughout the songs. And this is kind of a concept album, so it really flows all the way through. And it has some real standout songs like Fallen and Communion in the Oracle, which might be my favorite, or Egypt. Absolutely love that song. But whereas with the Odyssey, I ranked it high because of the Odyssey specifically, this one is number one to me because it's just so consistent throughout. It's just a great album from start to finish, really flows. But this has everything I love about Symphony X. Russell Allen's killer vocals, Michael Romeo is shredding the crap out of the guitar. All the other members are at peak form here. It's just really the perfect example of Symphony X's music to me. And so at number one, we have the New Mythology Suite from 2000. So there are my rankings of the Symphony X studio albums. I'd be curious to know how you would all rank these, so let me know in the comments and you can tell me where I was right or wrong in my rankings. And if there's other bands you want me to cover in these ranking videos, let me know. I have a few in mind, but I'm always open to suggestions. And of course, subscribe, hit the bell notification, like, comment, share, all that good stuff. And I'll see you in the next video. Till then, stay proggy.